Welcome everyone to this webinar. It's part of the Faithful Green Leaders Training. These learning labs are aimed at strengthening and building green teams. And this webinar is about alternatives to building an ark, reducing flood damage. I want to introduce my colleague, Anna Awimbo, who is the Director of Leadership Development, and to share how these webinars, the learning labs, are an integral part of our training.
Thanks, Kolya. Yeah, and welcome everyone, and Happy New Year. As you might already know, as Kolya mentioned, these learning labs serve as a supplement to our Faithful Green Leaders training. If you've been to our website lately, you've probably noticed that we've already scheduled the next 3 series of core trainings. So I encourage you, if you haven't yet attended any one of those core trainings, take a look and see if one of those dates works for you. We'll have 3 this year, and I'll put the link in for the first training in the chat in a minute so that you can all sign up whenever you're ready. So let's jump back in. Back to you, Kolya.
Great, thank you, Anna. I'd like to invite us to an opening prayer, and I've chosen a prayer that is taken from the Book of Common Prayer, and this is a prayer for our common life. It's adapted by Will Ed Green. Oh God, you have bound us together in a common life. Help us in the midst of our struggles for justice and truth to confront one another without hatred or bitterness, and to work together with mutual forbearance and respect. In the midst of this troubled time, protect us from greed, ignorance, malevolence, and help us make our nation one of peace, liberty, and justice in harmony with all of your creation, and exhibit the love with which you have called us in all of your diversity. Beloved, amen.
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 So we will begin this webinar with flooding stories from congregations and communities that have experienced flooding directly. The first one of those is from Still Meadow Community Church, Community Fellowship, pastored by the Reverend Michael Martin. We're going to show a brief video that talks about some of their responses to the serious flooding that occurred there on May 27th, 2018 on Frederick Avenue, Baltimore. Here's just one image of cars with the water level almost up to the windows.
Well, I always had a sump pump, but I installed a second sump pump. We graded the area, trying to make sure that water doesn't rise. And if there's any heavy rainfall, my neighbors can attest to this, they will see me out there cleaning out all the drains, even in the rain. Because, people have said, why don't you wait for the city to clean the drain? Well, the city is not going to be flooded, but I will be.
Yeah, so one of the things that we did as a church community was, and something that we're still doing, is trying to ensure that we are limiting the water runoff from our property down along the corridor. So we've done like a greening survey. We have worked to improve, make some of our surfaces more porous so that it can absorb the water rather than the water running off. We have a large parking lot, and that is a problem at times. It's a contributor. So we've done some things to make it more porous, and we have some plans to improve that work. In addition to that, one of the things that we've really focused on, and we did this right after the flood, was to try to help families, as well as try to ensure that our property is resilient. Now, that doesn't stop the flooding, but it helps so that when the flooding happens, we don't experience property damage.
And that one there, we ain't taking no chances. As soon as we hear the words thunderstorm, we're in the church. You guys, the Still Meadows parking lot, the church lot is how we all refer to it. And I understand that you got the high ground. Literally, you've got the higher ground around here. So that's why we put it up there. It's cheaper than 1,000, 1,500 hours every time it rains.
But what we're doing is making sure that we conduct ourselves as a city that is mature and that we don't forget. So there's a lot of education going on now and preparatory stuff, right? And thinking systemically about how do we change water flow, how do we put in barriers, how do we think about, just a bunch of different things. And so staying on our folks and saying thank you for coming when this was happening, but we want to know what you're going to do a year later. That's kind of what we're doing.
Well, that's one example, and they certainly experienced quite a lot of flooding along Frederick Avenue. And here's another example in Odenton. This was posted by Frederick Tutman, the Patuxent Riverkeeper, and this flood occurred just last August 13 of 2020. And here's an example of Empowering Believers Apostolic Church in Glen Burnie. Flooding on the left, and then they installed many projects around the grounds, including this very large installation of a rain garden. On the other side are bioswales as well as cisterns. So it has reduced the flooding tremendously. And so next on deck is Larry Ryan, Green Team Leader at St. Peter's Lutheran Church in Ocean City. And he's going to share how his congregation has responded to the local climate impacts by taking action there.
All right, thank you. I'm also a member of the Delaware, Maryland Synod ELCA Creation Care Ministry team, as is Susan Meyer on the presentation. So on slide 1, yes, you can see on the first slide there that there is flooding that occurs in Ocean City. This flooding is mostly related to storms, and it occurs more frequently now at the south end of town. The last significant round of high tide flooding happened south of Division Street on October 11th, 2019, when subtropical storm Melissa was offshore, but no stormy weather was in town. Recently, the frequency of flooding has been seen up to 10 times a year. In 2018, the Union of Concerned Scientists projected Ocean City will have more than 30 tidal floods per year by 2030 and more than 170 a year by 2045. Okay, slide 2. It was June 15th of 2015 when St. Peter's flipped the switch on our 105 kW solar array. We now have we save over $2,500 a year off a 12.9 cent per kilowatt hour electricity rate. We generate an it was in June 15th of 2015 when St. Peter's flipped the switch on our 105 kilowatt solar array. We now save over $2,500 per year off a 12.9 cent per kilowatt hour rate. We generate an average of 12 megawatt hours of electricity per month. We agreed to this power purchase agreement to realize a savings, but it became a witness to caring for creation by St. Peter's while indirectly helping protect our neighbors from being impacted by flooding. Since 2015, the solar array saved burning 120 tons of coal, or the equivalent of 500 barrels of oil. We've produced nearly 813 megawatt hours of electricity since our switch. St. Peter's now produces more electricity than we use. Okay, slide 3. Our church creation care ministry team, in conjunction with the Delaware Maryland Lutheran Synod, has become active in Maryland legislation that is advocating for us to move into our clean and renewable energy future. In so doing, we are actively involved with promoting the benefits of offshore wind farm planned off the coast of Maryland. The purpose of all these efforts is to reduce the volume of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, one of the causes of global warming. This addresses the problem of flooding and sea level rise at its source by helping to slow warming and glacial ice melt globally. This advocacy is seen by some at our church as being political. This ministry's purpose, however, is to promote sustainability for our posterity and to project a vision of God's intention for humanity as creation's caregivers. Creation Care Ministry also advocates for the economic and racial justice for disadvantaged and climate justice for the least of these, for whom God promises the hope of redemption. Slide 4. Okay. St. Peter's has had and held several renewable energy advocacy events. At an Ocean City Town Council meeting in February 2018, there was an offshore wind hearing that many attended, including our pastor and myself. This meeting promoted a plan by mayor and council to make a public their resolution that they would only support offshore wind turbines that were not in the view shed from the beach. The public was not informed that this meeting was only to be a public statement of their resolution and provided no opportunity for comment. This made the Ocean City Council meeting uncomfortable for many, since they were prepared to give testimony at the meeting. Okay, so you can see also on slide 4 that we sponsored the Citizens Forum for Renewable Energy, and this flyer was used to promote the Ocean City Citizens Renewable Energy Forum that was held on March 3rd of 2018 at St. Peter's. This was our response to allow the public a chance to make comments. We also had a very good local speaker, Greg Farley, who was the director of sustainability at Washington College at the time. He now holds that position at George Mason University. Okay, slide 5. The Wonders of the Wind Art Show was held at St. Peter's from May 5th to May 12th, 2018. Mr. Mike Prettle, the then president and lawyer for Wicomico Environmental Trust, was our featured speaker. At the closing ceremony for about 50 people, there were about 50 artwork submissions, and prizes were offered to several of the submissions that are shown on the slide that you see. Okay, slide 6. From 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 12. We have such a hope, we act with great boldness. Inspired by scripture, we are motivated to share our love of God's gift of creation and share our hopes and visions of how we go from our current reality to sharing dreams of a just and sustainable post-carbon future and how to get there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Larry.
Okay.
That was wonderful. I really appreciate you offering all of the experience that you've had there at St. Peter's, and also focusing on addressing climate change as one of the primary causes of increased flooding and
Absolutely. Thank you.
rising tides in our region. Well, next on deck, I'd like to introduce Greg Sandy from the Maryland Department of Environment. He'll be sharing some basic information about the causes of flooding and some of the reasons why we're having increased flooding. So take it away, Greg, and just tell me next on the slides and I'll advance them for you.
All right. Well, you guys have probably seen I have a co-presenter here that kind of wandered down into the basement because her mother's out picking up her older daughter.
Okay.
So what I'm going to give you is just a quick overview on you know, the changes in landscape and how they affect your flood risk. This photo is one from the Patapsco, sorry, and that was during some of the recent floods. And the Patapsco gets a lot of heat around here because it's a big river and it's next to Ellicott City, and it had a lot of history of big floods going in the future. Next slide, please. So watersheds. I assume you guys know what watersheds are, but I'd like to just kind of go over it real quick. It's just the area of land that contributes to a specific type of water body, or, you know, like a river or a stream or the ocean or whatever. It's the entire land area that contributes, so that when rain hits on one side of it, it's going to come out the pipe at like a, say, the Potomac or the Bay, or even your local streams. So they can be big, they can be small. There's many of them, and they're mapped a lot of different ways. Next, please. So development. You know, we all hear how the ground is a great sponge, and you know that when you remove that sponge and you replace it with a hard surface, what it does is it basically takes all that water that would have gone into the ground and pushes it downstream, essentially. The way our stormwater networks work in the past, they were designed to move water as quickly as possible from one area to the next. And so when your like watershed has development impacts above you, that means what they were doing is they're taking all that water and shoving it as quickly as possible off their property into the streams and rivers around you, which means that more impervious surface above your property area in that watershed will increase the amount of water that you could potentially be dealing with downstream. I just pulled this picture off of our one of our story maps, because as you all have seen in some of the other presentations, that green infrastructure and pervious surface addition to development has significant potential to remove flooding for people downstream. Next slide, please. And this picture is from Holland Island. It's pretty iconic Chesapeake Bay island that's disappeared, more or less. Used to be populated, but it's just one of the few that, you know, is going underwater, essentially. But some of it's just traditional movement of water within the bay, but climate change is going to be a big deal coming up forward, particularly in the bay. It's going to, the bay is like a big bathtub. And so when you start backing water up into it, water climbs the surfaces out of the banks much faster than a lot of other areas. So we can see a lot more daytime flooding, as Larry was kind of talking about, where you don't have a storm, but you're still flooding because the tides are moving up. Again, you know, the ocean expands when it's absorbing all this heat from climate change. And so, you know, you think about when water boils, what happens? It goes up and turns in, you know, it goes higher in the pan. So it does the same when it's out in the ocean, it's absorbing all this heat. So that's going to contribute to it as well. As you can see, like in the past couple of years, we've seen a lot of flashier, stronger, more powerful storms that dump a lot of water really quick. And our systems are just not ready for that kind of volume. So we can expect non-tidal flooding in our streams and rivers to increase as well, particularly if it's in areas with very high slopes. Then again, like, you know, it's kind of described here, your stormwater systems were designed for old storms. They weren't designed for the newer, flashier storms as well. So you may have, even if you have clean gutters or clean entryways, they still may get overwhelmed with all this kind of rain. So just something to be aware of. Next slide, please. So what can you do? A lot of the times, you know, flooding can't be prevented, but what I would like to do is take this time to give you a few key things that you can take away from this, and then Kevin will give you some more tools to kind of know what to do once, you know, you're preparing for flooding. But the first one is definitely to plan for the worst and hope for the best, because if you don't know what's going on around you, you're going to get caught unaware, and being caught unaware is traditionally how like the worst stuff happens. Take advantage of existing programs. There are a lot of programs that deal with flooding, insurance, emergency response. Just knowing if emergency responders can even get to you in a flooding situation is important. And then finally, just get to know your state and local agencies that are working to help you. Relationships are the biggest thing that produce the best results. So good relationships with your local officials and, you know, being in the know are probably the best things you can do. But Kevin will talk you through some additional things that you can do to protect yourself during a flood and after. That's it.
Great. Thanks a lot, Greg, for offering that great introduction to the problems and causes of flooding. Really appreciate it. So now we're going to move on to introduce Kevin Wagner. He's from the Water and Science Administration of Maryland Department of Environment. So take it away, Kevin.
Thank you, Golia. Thank you, Greg, too. So good evening, everyone. I have a lot to really cover, but I'm gonna talk very fast just so we can get through all the material. But if you can go back for 1 second so I can kind of explain that picture, because I'm especially proud of it, I guess, because I live out in Frostburg, Maryland, in Western Maryland. And chances are, if you've driven on the interstate going through I-68, you've seen this Noah's Ark being rebuilt and has been for about 30 years now. It's an interesting story if you want to read up on that and Google that about the God's Ark of Safety. But, you know, I kind of joke sometimes with my communities that I work with that, you know, if things get really bad, sea level rise gets bad, I'm going to go and help to construct this thing. But the reality is we're all going to be dealing with these challenges. So I'm going to go through a variety of things just to kind of explain what I do, what we do, and how you might fit into it. Next. So, you know, I'm going to talk about the National Flood Insurance Program, and hopefully that's not the first time you've ever heard that word, but just kind of explain what that's all about, how that works, that process with the mapping and the data and the ordinance that your local government has to adopt to be a part of the program. And that makes flood insurance available to you. But I'm also going to go through a lot of other things that you can think about that maybe you can do to protect your churches, your properties, figuring out where that risk is and all that. But if you don't remember anything else from tonight.
You're muted, Kevin.
I hit the wrong button. But if you don't remember anything else, I just put in my chat my phone number. So call me if you have any questions. That's what we're here for. Next. So real quick, you know, got to give a shout out to the bosses, Secretary Grumbles and Horacio Tablata, our Secretary and Deputy. We have a variety of things that we do. Missions in Maryland Department of the Environment are very important. So even though Greg and I are talking specifically about water related programs, keep in mind, we are also very interested in air and land related issues as well. Next. So no surprise, I think Greg already covered these already, and you've seen some pictures. There's a variety of reasons of why it floods. You know, we're seeing more and more this stormwater runoff, which we're referring to as urban flooding, but also high tides, coastal storm events, nor'easters, hurricanes that create these king tides and nuisance floods. But riverine flash floods, that was a big problem with Still Meadow Community Fellowship, but also this other category of water main breaks, sewer backups. And you're saying, what? Next slide. Urban flooding, picture there, Baltimore City, actually. You know, so it's the water has no place to go. The drainage systems are overwhelmed. And we deal with this, and this is being more and more common. People get caught off guard. They drive into an area, so do not drive through these areas. If you can't see the pavement, you should not be driving through that. Turn around, don't drown, as we like to say. Next. But nuisance flooding, the technical definition here that we use in the state is that it's high tide flooding that causes a public inconvenience. So it's a very subjective definition. Certainly, it sounds like Ocean City is dealing with this multiple times a year. But anyway, that's another type of flooding that we're working on. Next. But water main break, I mentioned this, and this surprises people that even though areas are not near river systems, near oceans, if a water main were to break and it floods 2 properties, that qualifies, it meets the definition of an insurance definition of a flood. So it may be a covered loss. Next. So a little bit about the National Flood Insurance Program before I really get into it. So it's this national program set up through the federal government. And, you know, there's debate of whether it's a good program or a bad program. I'm biased. I think it's a really good program. It's over 22,000 communities participate in this. In Maryland, we have 147. But it established a framework that works with local governments to implement this based on mapping. And the local government is reviewing development, issuing permits, and the idea is to reduce risk. So, there's a lot of benefits to it. Mostly it's for flood insurance, but it could be disaster assistance. But the key is that it's a partnership between the federal government and the community. And what do I mean by that? Next slide. The community is really just a local government. It's whatever entity you live in. So I've heard some folks from Ocean City are in. So the town of Ocean City is a participating community. If you're in Anne Arundel County, I saw some pictures from Odenton and Glen Burnie. They are a participating community. So they have the regulatory authority to adopt these regulations. Next. But they have the biggest stake in this. They have to review permits. They look at the FEMA maps. Are these development projects in or out of a floodplain, a map floodplain? And if they are, there's certain criteria that they have to follow. But they're working with us, they're working with FEMA, they're submitting technical information, but they are an excellent resource. Of course, I'm always glad to help you, but I would really encourage you to figure out who your local government contacts. So I think that was great information by Greg. They could be extremely helpful. Next. So in our role, what I do, we're the state coordinating office for the National Flood Insurance Program. So we are assisting all 147 of those communities, mostly with technical stuff about permits and mapping and sometimes insurance. We are doing a lot of outreach these days and all this kind of stuff. So I really enjoy doing these types of meetings because, man, we've engaged with just some excellent people out there, Southwest Baltimore, Frederick Avenue, but Turner Station and Dundalk and Ocean Pines, just all across the state. That we are going beyond local government level and really trying to dig into the communities. But now it's kind of like a capacity issue. There's just not enough of me to go around. Next. So just to kind of throw some numbers out there, we have over 65,000 flood insurance policies. I think there's over 20,000 are actually in the town of Ocean City. But they provide over $16.1 billion in insurance coverage throughout the state. So that's buildings, that's contents. So that's a big number, but really that number isn't really representing the true risk out there. These are only insurable properties. So in many cases, it's optional. In some cases, it's not. If you have a mortgage, it might be required. But anyway, it's a program that's available because your community participates. Next. So I'm going to step through each one of these triangles very quickly because I have a short amount of time. But these are the three components of the program: the maps and data about knowing your risk, the regulations and floodplain management and mitigation actions, that's reducing your risk. And then finally, insuring your risk through the National Flood Insurance Program and flood insurance policies. Next. So when we talk about maps on the flood insurance side, we're really dealing with these things called flood insurance rate maps. They have other technical documents and information that go along with it, the flood insurance study. But the mapping is really the starting point of the whole conversation of, what is the risk? What does FEMA say the risk is? And, then take action from there. Next. So the map, it's based on different criteria, recurrence intervals. We typically look at the 100-year flood, as a lot of people call it. But in statistical terms, that's the 1% annual chance flood event. That doesn't roll off the tongue as easily, so we call it the 100-year flood. But don't misunderstand that it's not, once we have that flood, it's going to be another 99 years before we have another similar event. We could have these events back to back. And as we've heard about in Ellicott City, they call it that 1,000-year flood within 2 years. Anyway, this is just what these maps show. They also show the 0.2% annual chance flood event, which is the 500-year floodplain. But hey, at the end of the day, maps don't follow flood boundaries. It's going to flood where it floods. This is just what sets up this national program for flood insurance rating and floodplain management and development review. Next. So the key zones, when we're talking about high risk areas, are highlighted in red, and these are the A zones and the V zones, which V zones are more coastal areas like you might see in Ocean City along the beach. But these are where the mandatory purchase requirement for flood insurance come into play. If there's a federally backed loan, or if you're going through a development project and you're getting hit with, oh my gosh, now the community's I thought I was doing a good job by getting a permit, but now they're making me do all these other things because I'm in the floodplain, and this is why. Next. So this is just an example of a map from Charles County, a little snippet of a map. You know, it's just this shaded area. And you know, this is just a paper version of it. I'm going to show you a digital version where we have all these neat mapping tools that we can interact with the data. But I'm going to show you other resources that you can go to, and maybe as your homework assignment, enter in your information. So really the dark shaded area is where we focus primarily, but those lighter shaded areas on the edges, that's the 500-year floodplain. So it really doesn't come into play as much. Next slide. I'm not going to get into the floodway. It's that hatched area. That's more technical stuff. So if try to avoid the floodway, let's just put it that way. We have had some churches that had dealings with the floodway, and they were surprised by a lot of the requirements, but it gets a little tricky. Next. On the coastal side, we have this funny thing called the limit of moderate wave action. And really all it means is that, you know, you have wave energy associated, and wave heights could get up to 1.5 feet. So FEMA has mapped that line on a map to kind of show you where that's happening. Next slide. And what that looks like from a cross section. So you had that black line that was on the map. But if you're standing on the beach at Ocean City looking down towards the inlet, you know, you'll see these structures that are elevated on pilings. But as you move out of those velocity areas, the V zones, energy dissipates, and then it transitions to an AE zone. The building requirements are very different in those two zones. So traditionally in A zones, you could build on a block foundation and all that kind of stuff. But the problem is the wave energy doesn't stop beyond that V zone line. So FEMA started showing where that energy kind of enters slowly into the landscape. So if you are within these areas defined by the limit of moderate wave action, you may actually have to start building to those V zone requirements where you're up on pilings. Next slide. Couple sources where you can look and learn about this information is the FEMA Map Service Center. And by the way, I think this presentation is going to be shared and you'll have all these links afterwards. But there's just a ton of information in there about the maps, the studies, the map changes, the digital data. But the neat thing is that you can go on there and type your address, and I'd encourage you to do that and kind of make your own map of your property. You can make this thing called a FIRMET, a flood insurance rate map, sort of small version of it. Next slide. But we're very proud of our system in Maryland, mdfloodmaps.net, our flood risk application. So that's a tool that we've stood up over 10 years ago. And you can do the same thing. You can go in there, you can type in your address, and it pulls up data layers, and you can interact with it and see what those risk areas are. But essentially, it's the blue shaded areas where that high risk area is, at least from FEMA's purposes. Next. But we don't want to stop there. We spend a lot of time focusing on the FEMA floodplain, but we realize there's a lot of damage occurring outside the FEMA floodplain. Unfortunately, a lot of regulations don't cover that. So now we're starting to look beyond the FEMA boundary with this thing called the CoastSmart Climate Ready Action Boundary, which is 3 feet vertical and then extending that line horizontally. And what does that look like? Right now, this is really just for state type of development and projects, but we're going to make this available to local governments as kind of an advisory area that maybe you want to consider, you know, if you have a project that you start to elevate and you start to do different things. Next. Other really neat tools out there that's quite interesting. Realtor.com. I love looking at real estate. It's just, I don't know, weird hobby of mine, but they've added a lot of neat information to their website now. So you can actually type in any address and they'll show you both the FEMA information and this other information from Flood Factor that really goes into a lot of details. Next. So going to the next part of the circle here, floodplain management and regulations, we're not going to get too far in the weeds of this. Really, it boils down to your community's floodplain management ordinance. Every community has to adopt minimum criteria. One of the things we strongly encourage is going higher than FEMA, building higher, elevating higher, and that's called freeboard. Next. And when you go higher, guess what? You save more money on flood insurance. Not only are you reducing the risk of that structure, being more resilient, but you are saving a significant amount of money on flood insurance. Next. Example here in Crisfield of an elevated structure, just to give you a sense of what that looks like in an A zone. Next slide. And here's one that looks what it looks like in a V zone in Calvert County. So that's more the velocity of the coastal area. You can see the Chesapeake Bay in the background there, right through that house. Next. So the next piece of reducing your risk are all these mitigation actions. What kind of things can you do to reduce risk? So I'm going to step through each one of these things kind of quickly, but keep flood insurance in mind. That can be a great mitigation tool to help. Next. So flood resistant materials, don't use things like regular drywall or regular fiberglass insulation. Use materials that if they get wet, you could just hose them off and be ready to go again. So think about things like cement board and brick and tile and marine grade plywood and that kind of thing. So I think there's ways that you can do this and still make the interior spaces look aesthetically pleasing, but you're also kind of preventing those future kind of, damages and follow-up that might occur. Next slide. Flood openings are critically important for any kind of enclosure in a floodplain. So if you have an enclosed area and you're in a FEMA map floodplain, more often than not, we're going to be looking for these flood openings to kind of balance the pressure of those floodwaters. Next slide. They usually have to be within 12 inches of grade, but what you want is you want that water pressure to equalize inside and outside. When you get into a situation where there's more pressure on the outside than in the inside, you lead to foundation collapse, and that's bad news. Next. Subgrade crawl spaces are another common issue that we have where water goes in and it can't get back out. You're pumping the water to try to get it out. So you really want to try, when we're doing new construction, for example, we want to make sure the inside grade and the outside grade are matched, or the inside grade is higher so that water can drain out. Next. Backflow prevention valves. If you have drains and systems like that, getting that back up through the system is another sort of common problem. So you can actually put these backflow prevention valves to prevent that from happening. Next. HVAC units, we see these all the time. These are the first things that always get damaged. They're sitting on the ground a lot of times. So you're going to start seeing this all the time. When you see these elevated on platforms, chances are they're in a floodplain and they're required to elevate them. Next. But utilities, there are ways that you could do it in dealing with it. You can elevate it on platforms. Next slide. Or you could do like a barrier around it where you kind of seal a particular area from preventing water from getting in there. But every situation is a little bit different. It just depends on what your situation's like. Next slide. Fuel tanks, whether it's oil tanks, which are commonly inside, those need to be anchored to prevent flotation. That was a big problem in Isabel, Bowley's Quarters. A lot of the homes had these oil tanks. They flipped over and a lot of oil was spilled and a lot of contamination. Next. And similarly with propane tanks, if they're outside, they are also buoyant things, and during a flood event, they can lift and they can float away. So there's anchoring that you can get from them. And usually it's like at Home Depot, you can buy anchoring brackets that you would use. Next. Same thing with heating oil tanks outside. Next. And let's not forget all these accessory buildings, the sheds and all those, buildings. Even our church, has these accessory buildings to store equipment and things like that. But if you're in a floodplain, these too need to be anchored. We need to have flood openings. If we have electric service, that needs to be elevated. So while we focus on the main structure, we always like to talk about these other ones too. Next. And finally, on the insurance side of the equation with the NFIP, first and foremost, check with your agent. There's a lot of variables that go into this, but understand there's building and contents coverage, but it is available to anyone in the community because your community participates. That includes homeowners, business owners, churches, renters, it doesn't matter. There's building and contents. Next. But usually you can buy it through the Write Your Own companies, we call them, which is basically your nationwide insurance, Allstate. If you have homeowners policy or commercial policy, chances are they also sell the policy. But there's a variety of things that go into the rate. It depends on what flood zone you're in, how deep the flood water could potentially get, if you have an enclosure, flood opening, so on and so forth. Next. The elevation certificate is a tool that I'm not going to go too far into this, but it's a form that you might need to deal with on insurance, but that can really help your rate. Next. And then sometimes on the commercial side, these non-residential floodproofing certificates can also kind of help. Next. So I kind of covered this, but usually it takes 30 days for these policies to take effect. But if you're in a low risk area, you're not in that shaded area, you can purchase a preferred risk policy for as little as $325 a year. And that's great protection. But read the policy, know what's covered, know what isn't. Next. we're not going to get into this, but this is a technical rating material that agents use. But I just wanted to highlight that you're going to see higher rates for subgrade crawl spaces that I showed you a picture of. The HVAC units are not elevated, or a lack of flood openings that help to balance those pressures. Next. Grants. How am I going to pay for this, right? Insurance, you're on your own. There's no grant for that. But if there's a major project you're thinking about, there's a variety of different grant programs. Next. And here's one in Dorchester County. They call it Hupper's Island. But this was a church that was being elevated. And here's kind of the during process. And then next, here's a completed. So it doesn't have to look aesthetically terrible. Yeah, it's going to be inconvenient. You have steps, you might have ramps, there's flood openings you can see, but it is possible. Next. And then the last kind of point here is, really the preparation side. We've given you a ton of information, but, making a plan, being prepared, building a kit, staying informed, working with your neighbors, having each other's phone number, that was a tremendous help in any kind of disaster. And it was really neat. I just smile every time I watch the Still Meadow videos. I'm really proud of that whole project. We were part of that with the Silver Jackets team, and they really came together, sharing information, helping each other. So that's really what it's all about. Next. And that's about all I have. I mean, these are just some publications that I'll share with you, but you can look at those at your leisure. Next. But the one I like the most is this one, How to Protect Your Home from Flooding. It's just a short brochure. It's one of the links. Tells you what you can do inside the home and outside the home, but really some really easy, low-cost things. Next. That's all I have.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kevin. We really have benefited a great deal by all the information resources you've offered in a very quick order. So thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. Well, we've come to that time in the webinar in which we can address your questions. And so I'm going to ask my colleague Anna if there are questions in the chat, and those who still have questions you didn't enter the chat, please go ahead or unmute yourself and chime in. But let's address the chat first.
Yeah, so we don't have any questions yet in the chat. So if anyone has questions, you can just unmute yourself and jump in. I actually have one question to start that might be on several people's minds. During this pandemic, has emergency response been affected in any way? And should congregations be aware of any changes?
Who's that question directed towards?
It could be either you, Kevin, or...
Yeah, I'm not directly involved on the church level in the response to COVID, so I probably really couldn't give you a good answer. However, I have been a part of different conversations, and this has been kind of a dialogue that several states and organizations are having. The church could really play a great role, I think, in providing support. Of course, you got distancing and masking and sanitation and things to be aware of. But for example, in Still Meadow, they've been doing food distribution as part of this pandemic, which has been really a neat engagement process that we've all actually kind of piggybacked on, and you can distribute information about flood preparedness and other things.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. Great, that's helpful. We have another question here from Bonnie. Are the grants available only if buildings are in jeopardy?
Yeah, so generally these grants are only directed towards kind of, well, it depends on what kind of project we're dealing with. If we're talking about a building that you want to elevate, or maybe you want to acquire and demolish or relocate is another option you could do for mitigation. A lot of those grants that I provided links to quickly will help to address that kind of stuff. Cemetery is a little bit different. I'm not aware of any kind of a grant that will help to relocate. And that is a serious issue, especially on the shore, the lower shore, that as sea levels rise, erosion happening, it's exposing cemeteries. And, the Maryland Historical Trust, I think, is trying to kind of help, like, with some grants related to cataloging some of this and doing some information, but I'm not aware of a grant that really helps mitigate that.
Mhm.
Great. One more question. This is from Allison Peterson. She says, I didn't hear either of the speakers use the term water table. Our congregation has an issue with a high rising water table. Is that due to climate change? And what are your thoughts for mitigation?
I'm going to kick that one to Greg because I think he actually had that in a slide where he showed watersheds. There was a water table in that profile. Greg, are you still on?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Greg.
Yeah, and in some ways, yes, climate change can do that. Just regular changes in weather patterns, like if you get an El Nino year, and some things like that also do it as well. So it isn't just climate change; it's more about how much water you tend to get in a year. So yes, absolutely. I remember in Dorchester County there was a drought a couple years ago, and now they're dealing with the same issue. The water table is at the surface, and so they have had problems before with getting water. Now they have problems with getting rid of water. Any thoughts on mitigation? I guess it would depend on where that water is getting into your structure. Obviously, like, and I'm in my basement, I have sump pumps. They may not do everything, but I have a French drain and sump pumps in my structure that helps. Grading around the outside of the structure helps as well. Those are you want to get the water focused away from you. So even channeling, like if you do like French drains or channels outside your structure, you can take the water from that rising groundwater and push it in other areas. But again, this might be where grants could come in, and not necessarily like emergency management grants, but maybe something like from a Chesapeake Bay Trust or other folks that allow you to do best management practices that'll help you kind of redirect water. And I know traditionally we talk about water quality and getting it into the ground, but in this case, maybe in that they would allow you to put it somewhere else so that it like drains to a wetland and uses a nice wetland or makes a new wetland. There are some options, but I would have to know more about the specifics, I say, to give you any kind of like direct thoughts for that kind of mitigation.
Thanks, that was helpful.
Are there any other questions in the chat, or folks can unmute themselves and just speak right out?
Yeah, I'm typing one in right now for Kevin.
Yeah,
Okay.
I can go on. There's one here from Jessie. She says, I'm working with a friend on a highly degraded stream bed where erosion aggravates flooding. Would flood reduction strategies also help with this related problem?
Yeah, I'll start and then Greg can correct me and add anything that I missed. But this is a serious problem with a lot of our urban watersheds where we have high velocities, doing this scouring and erosion down cutting of stream channels and things like that. So you're seeing more and more communities do like restoration projects to try to slow the water down and to widen it out a little bit, add some meanders. So in some cases, I think stream restoration projects could help address some of that.
Yeah, I mean, they can. Unfortunately, like once the system's out of balance, it'll keep eroding until it's back into some kind of balance. Right. Like the head cuts will just keep moving further and further up the stream. The only way to truly solve that though is to deal with it at the source, and that's where I was talking about, like, having development above you. If it was instead of like the old model where they just got it off the surface as quickly as possible and into the streams, if you institute new practices where you remove that impervious surface and you allow it to soak into the water or into the ground, or detention and structures that allow the water to like kind of gather in one spot and then slowly dissipate over time. There are existing ways to engineer around it, but again, it'll depend on your situation as well. And
it's in a situation where it's out of balance, sadly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you, Jesse.
Yeah, I mean, we often talk about like rain barrels and greening projects, and even you heard it in the video, the pastor talking about trying to keep the water on site. So
Mhm.
if everybody in the watershed kind of contributes and does that kind of thing, it could be a great community project and really bring people together too.
Mhm. Yeah, one of the things I recall from one of the other videos about Still Meadow and the flooding on Frederick Avenue was the observation that the cemetery up the street had had a lot of trees removed in recent years. And of course, trees are a great absorber of water. And I'm not saying that's the only cause, but it may have contributed somewhat. So the more water absorbing landscapes with trees and rain gardens and retaining the water, we like to say where the rain falls as close to the raindrop as possible can help. I did have a question about homeowners. Some of the remediations, or actually from a builder standpoint, if you're starting from the ground zero of building walls that aren't made out of drywall, do you know of grants available if one wanted to replace drywall in your basement or elsewhere or something like that and make more water resistant?
Yeah, it's a good question, but I mean, for that level of detail, no. Usually when communities are pursuing grants on behalf of property owners, it's for elevation projects, it's for acquisition down, really big things. I'm not aware of, like to assist with drywall replacement. And Larry asked me one about assistance with a heat pump that they're going to be replacing. It's going to be tied into the church, and they're looking to improve efficiency and things like that. But so a lot of these grant programs, there are certain restrictions and criteria, and it's a process, especially when you're dealing with federal government, it can be a lengthy process that you're going through. But I'd encourage you to reach out again to your local governments, because you just never know. I mean, I recommended to Larry to go to the local emergency services department, because oftentimes, that's the agency that's leading a lot of these mitigation grants. So they have their, thumb on the pulse of what's available out there, and maybe they can provide some ideas.
Thanks.
Thank you, Kevin.
I have a question. I don't know. I think it's for Kevin or Greg. So the picture that we used in the promotion of this, Empowering Believers Church, they found themselves in that position because over time, all this development happened around them. So 20 years ago, they didn't have that problem, but all this development happened around them. So now they were in that position, and they've done a great job with rain gardens and things, and they've mitigated that problem mostly. Are there laws or regulations that folks could advocate for to keep that sort of thing from happening in the future? So like watching when development is going to happen, is there any particular, is there a community that has really good restrictions that keep that from happening? Or where can you see things like that be strengthened? Either does it have to be on a local level, or are there things on the state level that we could be helping folks to advocate for?
So I'll take that one. And we do have a state law for stormwater that's called environmental site design. And what that basically means is using a lot of microbioretention, small practices that treat water on site and try to infiltrate it into the ground as quickly as possible. The goal is to mimic woods in good condition. So they're looking at the volumes that would be created by, the runoff in that area, and whether or not the woods, how much they would infiltrate it. And as long as you can infiltrate as much water as the woods in good condition would, then you are meeting the conditions of that law. That's for new development. And for redevelopment, they do require a 1-inch treatment. So it's not quite as robust, but when you think about it, there was nothing there before. So getting at least another 1-inch rainfall into the ground is helpful. Ultimately, though, I mean, with the new types of storms, these practices can get overwhelmed fairly easily too. I mean, all practices in stormwater get overwhelmed pretty easily, but they're designed, they were under old design. So I think to advocate for over design, I think is probably what I would suggest. And that's where I advocate for people internally, like, piggybacking BMP treatment systems, for example. Carroll County has a great filtration basin where it does a detention and then it's a release over time. They use ag drainage tiles underneath it. And so it filters through the bottom of it and comes out a 6-inch pipe on the back end. And it's held up pretty well to a lot of the bigger storms. I don't want to say it's a panacea, or it's not the silver bullet to every situation, but innovative design like that will help us deal with a lot of the stormwater runoff issues. So pushing for that over design is really where I've been trying to bring it to people's attention.
Thanks, Greg. Other questions?
I was very interested in what you were talking about with Still Meadow and Miracle City, because I actually taught in a school that's right down the street from them, that Beachfield Elementary Middle School, that for years got flooding, had to do with the drains and also the water coming down, almost downhill. And I guess as there was more paving, it just came down. And I remember one time coming out of the school and turning left, I guess it was left towards Still Meadow, and hit a wall of water just unexpectedly, and luckily could turn around to go in the other direction, but happened just like that. So yeah, I'm really glad to hear that they've been doing the work with it. That same storm that hit them, my parents had a house and they ran into problems because when they put some of the new pipes and things in, they changed the direction of where the water went. And instead of it flowing and getting absorbed by the ground, it backed up in the people next door and in their home and in the homes. And they eventually, did things that fixed that. They put in the French drains and all the trenches, and they had the county come back in to look to see if they had blocked a drain, which they had, and other things. But it was a little change like that can sometimes make a big difference.
Well, thanks for sharing that personal story, Marge. Very illustrative of.
Yeah, I might have to talk with you afterwards, because our department's part of what's called a Maryland Silver Jackets team. So we did a lot of work with Still Meadow community in putting together those video testimonies. And one of the things that we wanted to do was to work with the school to do like an educational outreach event with, we have this neat like 3D floodplain model. It's this big plastic plexiglass box that you can, show watersheds and streams, and the kids could pour water, and, you really have good conversation. They love it. So we were hoping to do that in the school, but of course COVID happened and we've kind of had to shift priorities a little bit, but I hope
I've got a good resource for you. I know the assistant principal and the principal.
Oh, excellent.
Very well. Yeah.
Great. Well, that's one thing these webinars are good, is about making connections and networking with one another.
Yeah.
Is
So
there anything
we're right
else?
around time.
Yes.
So a little over.
Anything else you want to add, Anna? And we'll wrap
No.
it up here.
Yeah, I think we're good.
Great. Well, just to reiterate, we have lots of resources for your green teams. If you're just beginning or you're been on the road for a while with your green team, we have learning labs into the future every first Thursday of the month, except for July and August. You'll see on our website. And do check out, if you want to build or grow your team, please check out our website to sign up for one of our future green team trainings. The next one's in February, the second, third, and fourth Thursday nights. It's a series, all in one training, and you'll learn a lot about what you can do and how to build your team. So thanks, everyone. And in closing, I just want to say thank you for all you're doing out there to care for God's creation, and may you continue to do so. And we look forward to you joining us on future Learning Labs.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you, Kolya. Good night.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.